Welcome to the Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot. HealthLaw HotSpot is a podcast for physicians and health professionals that covers the legal issues and trends that affect the healthcare industry.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the HealthLaw HotSpot. I'm Ericka Adler, shareholder at Roetzel and Andrus and leader of our healthcare practice. And today I'm joined by Laura Goodman, who's a partner in healthcare at FGMK. Laura is part of FGMK's healthcare practice and leads the entrepreneurial service group. She's provided accounting, tax, and financial management services to closely held healthcare, service, and real estate businesses for more than 30 years. Her expertise include compensation formula design and implementation, operational reviews, personal tax planning, strategic business consulting, and tax structuring and transaction planning. She also works with many medical and dental practices, and Laura and I have worked together on many of our clients and really excited to have her here today. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
So today we're going to talk about a really interesting topic that Laura and I actually just were talking about it with regard to our own clients. And we thought it would be a great topic to share with all of you out there. And this has to do with dishonesty in the practice, things that employees, contractors, and others within a practice do that may be illegal, financially inappropriate, etc., that harm the business, and what steps you can be taking to prevent that from occurring. So I think this will be a really helpful topic for everyone, and hopefully you take away some strategies and realize some of the things that you might be doing wrong in your own practice that you should think about changing. So Laura, why don't I turn this over to you? And I know we're going to kind of talk through some of our recommendations. So why don't we start with one of the recommendations that you think is most important? And I know you have some great examples you're going to share with us as well.
So when you're dealing with a small business, especially a small medical practice, it's really hard to have what we call in the accounting world segregation of duties. But it's very, very important to not have the same person, for example, posting payments into your practice management system and also making the bank deposits, or writing checks and also opening the bills that come in. And one example I'll share is a client that they had an employee, she was there a long time, but they realized all of a sudden that things weren't looking right. And then her husband actually turned her in because they didn't notice. And how this happened is the actual fraud, she was receiving checks from the insurance companies, and the insurance companies, the check would be made out to Dr. John Doe, and she would change the payment to, Jane Smith, care of Dr. John Doe. She would deposit them into her own bank account, and then she would go into the payment system and she'd just make an adjustment into the practice management system so the accounts receivable would go away. Now, again, if you had two different people doing those positions, eventually the practice would have seen, hey, this payer hasn't paid on this claim yet. It's still sitting out there. They'd call the payer would say, I paid, the check cleared, and it would have been caught. Now, this employee, when she was hired, and I'm going to skip to another thing you and I just spoke about, Ericka, they didn't run a background check. This employee's resume said that her prior job had been with an imaging center up across the border in Wisconsin, but that imaging center was now closed. So confirming her employment couldn't be done. The practice chose, after our recommendations, not to run a background check. Well, once the husband turned her in, we discovered that her last place of employment was in the laundry room at a federal penitentiary in Texas. And this is a completely true story. So she stole almost $300,000 from the practice before her husband found the bank account and saw the money in it and turned her in. So very, very important. You never want the same person authorizing transactions in the system that's also handling the bank and handling the actual money. Now, a few ways to get around this. If you have two people and you're getting live checks still, have your front desk person open up and make the bank deposits and then give a report to who's ever posting. Second option is try not to get live checks, especially now most payers are paying electronically. Set up ACH or work with your banker and set up a lockbox. Your checks go directly to the bank. the bank sends you images that you can post off of. But both of these things can help you limit the liability of having the same person being able to control what's posted as paid and what's actually going in your bank.
Right. I think that's great advice. And I think you and I were also talking about the reason that often there's only one person is in small practices, dental or medical practices, you often have small number of people working for you. So there's a person who wears many different hats. And sometimes in my experience, those people have been there for many years, 20, 30 years. They're like a work husband or work wife, and you totally trust them. You would never think they would do anything like that. But unfortunately, these things happen. And in my experience, it's usually somebody who has actually been there a long time. They're fully trusted to run the practice. Nobody even questions it. The doctor would never think to look over their shoulder. And typically it happens at a time when something might be going on in their life, right? You and I talked about this. Maybe they're going through a divorce, they're living beyond their means, they're having some kind of financial hardship. And this is when that happens. So, obviously you don't want to have to question someone just because they're going through a hardship in their life. Most people are not going to be criminals, right? But in order to prevent that from ever occurring, doctors do have to be a little bit more hands-on. They should be maybe having their accountant review the records more often and getting more involved, or maybe they're looking over the credit card statements once in a while and asking some question. You cannot just give complete control to somebody just because they work with you for a long time and assume that they're looking out for you.
Well, and the other thing to watch for is that long-term employee that you think is so loyal because they never take a vacation. That is the very first sign that there's trouble. They're worried about someone stepping in and catching what they're doing. A lot of our clients use us to do just that on a quarterly basis, a monthly basis. We'll just glance through things. Some of our clients that really only have one person have us reconcile their bank accounts for them, just so it's a separate set of eyes looking at everything. But yeah, the good, loyal old lady employee that you hear about all the time is typically your first guess if there's some fraud going on.
Right. And I think you're right about the whole not going on vacation. Other examples might be the drawer is locked. They're the only ones who have passwords to your account, right? Mm-hmm. We just did a podcast recently about an employee that was terminated and took over all the social media accounts. And the doctor realized that the doctor had given complete authority to this employee, which included control of, their Instagram account, their Facebook account. And think about the harm that could be done in terms of posting messages, taking the list, closing down the account and losing everything that they built. So it also applies to this situation, but here we're talking about money, right? There's never should be one person in your business who has passwords or access to everything if you, the owner of the business, do not also have that, right? So correct. That's a check and balance kind of process as well, right?
Correct. That's very important. The other thing that's important is to have a really good relationship with your banker. I had another fraud occurred with a client of mine, not actually with them, which was good. They were looking to acquire another business, and we were doing due diligence, and we couldn't get the accountant, the bookkeeper, controller, I don't know what his title was, of the other business. He wouldn't respond to us. He wouldn't schedule a date for us to come look at his books. It was getting fishy and frustrating. We finally went out there, and over the course of an 8-hour day of doing due diligence, we got 5 different sets of records and books. They kept changing. Finally, we called our client and said, we need to meet tonight. You got to walk away. This is just, there's no controls, there's no anything. We figured out that finally we got the bank statement from the bank, and their financial statements showed no debt. The bank showed a $3 million outstanding line of credit. It ends up again, this loyal employee of the target company was faxing wire transfer requests to the bank, forging the owner's signature, and then depositing the money personally. They had a CPA doing a reviewed financial statement that never picked up the debt, and that reviewed financial statement went to the bank, who never noticed that the books were showing 0 debt when there was really a $3 million line of credit. So this was one of those frauds where no one was looking where they should have been looking. They should have had controls in place. The CPA should have caught it. The bank should have caught it. The guy shouldn't have been doing it. But again, you've got to be careful that, again, with your bank, have a good relationship, have a system where the bank will not do any kind of a transfer of funds without your voice permission or without some kind of a double or triple authentication system in place, because faxes and e-signatures now are just too easy to cut and paste, and there's just more risk out there.
Right. I think that's great advice. And, one of the things that we were also talking about was that these are all examples of financial dishonesty. But when we're talking about dental practices and medical practices, there's other types of dishonesty that happens as well. And I've had many occasions where there are drugs and medications that are missing. I've had situations where people who work at the practice who regularly will call in patient prescriptions are calling them in for themselves or other individuals and then picking them up and selling them or using them, whatever it is. We even had a situation where somebody went into the electronic prescription system and put in a prescription and is able to then print it out and then cancel the prescription. So on the system, it looks like there was never a prescription ever made or filled, but in fact, they were then able to take the printout over to the pharmacy. And, this creates a couple different issues. The practice is responsible for making sure they understand the prescriptions that are going out under the doctor's names that work there. So one of the things they should be doing, in addition to making sure their system has double checks to see who's receiving a prescription, particularly for opioids, but whether the patients actually exist and whether they should have received the prescription, and if prescriptions are being written to people who are not patients of the practice. So some kind of auditing type process. But also there's an online system that physicians can check to see prescriptions that have been written under their name. So you can actually look in most states, if not all, to see what prescriptions have been written. And I do recommend an audit, monthly, quarterly, etc., just to make sure there's nothing on there that either doesn't match the name of a patient or doesn't match the prescription written to a patient. So drug theft is a huge issue in our physician practices. And, I don't know, I've never actually encountered somebody stealing devices, but I have encountered the theft of products, that
I have too.
particularly in terms of cosmetic products. So
yes,
that's something also that you want to keep some kind of log on and make sure, because that hurts the practice financially. That's a loss, right? So that's a big deal. And then the other one that we tend to come across as well, and I know you get involved as well, is just plain old fraud, where you have people working for you and they're making notes or coding or pretending to have done work that they didn't do. The practice sees a chart, they see that there's a description of work done, the date it was done, they submit it to a payor for payment. And we've had a couple of cases where Blue Cross Blue Shield or other payors have come in and investigated the practice because there was either a patient complaint or something that this work never occurred, it never happened, this doctor never did this, etc. And only at that time did the practice realize. Now, what happened with those payments when they were coming in? They were also diverted. So there was no check and balances going on between what was being billed and what was actually coming in, because the person knew that they were billing for work that wasn't actually done. And, again, it was a very high level manager that was able to achieve that. So, in the dental medical world, there's really some special nuances. And I think you and I both know that if a practice gets in trouble for fraud, particularly if there's federal patients involved, it's not just about money anymore. And
right.
it can be really hard to clear your name.
Right? And that ends up on the criminal scale. I mean, that is very, very dangerous. And on the smaller scale, your front desk people, which is often the lowest paying position in a medical practice. But your front desk people not only are the gatekeepers for your patients, the first people your patients see when they walk in the door, but they also have access to a lot of information. So again, these are typically smaller scale frauds when you see them. But for example, I come to see the doctor, I hand my credit card for my $100 copay. Well, that employee, if they take down my credit card number illegally, could very easily go to the credit card machine and issue a charge to me and then refund it to her or him. and get a refund done through the credit card processing on their own card. They can also take my money, but instead of if I pay with a check or cash, they can divert that and then again post in the practice management system that the payment was received or that it was adjusted off as a contractual adjustment or a bad debt, and then pocket the cash. So it's all about having good practices in place, making sure you're reconciling at the end of the night all of your receipts against all of your patients, making sure that you don't have phony phantom patients at the end of the day, that again, you're billing or you're showing collections, but you're really keeping those monies. I had one client who had an employee that kept putting in a phantom patient every Monday at 5. The 5 o'clock patients never showed. And the doctor couldn't figure out. Well, it ends up this one employee had a standing bowling date or something on Monday nights and didn't want to work. So she kept putting in a phantom patient. The patient canceled and she was able to leave work early. And that's not obvious theft, but it's money that the practice is losing because now they haven't seen those patients that could have filled that time slot. So some of these little things can really add up. They're frustrating and they're just lack of honesty. They're just bad behavior.
Right. I haven't seen that, but I have seen false vendors. And I know you told me a great story about that, which I'd love for you to share. But that's also a very common technique to be able to steal from a practice as well.
And I've seen that a couple of times, but the most egregious I've seen is for a home builder that their accounts payable clerk had a scheme going with her boyfriend. They created a fake construction company. They were paying bills for it. And in fact, at one point, a currency exchange got the check that this boyfriend was presenting and called the business to confirm that it was actually an appropriate check. Well, who did they steer it to? The accounts payable clerk, the girlfriend, who of course said, well, yes, it's good. Actually, they found footage from the closed circuit TVs, from the cameras and everything to prosecute, but we found it when we were reviewing their books and noticed that their costs were just getting really high all of a sudden with certain trades. And then we drilled down and found this new vendor and looked up the address, and it was her home address, and everything came tumbling down. We had another one that was in California that was another home builder back before I got into healthcare. One of the managers of the development company, and this was all funded by a big investment group, bought his fiance's engagement ring through the company and thought we wouldn't notice. And of course, that kind of rings out pretty loud and clear. So that wasn't a fake vendor. It was just an inappropriate vendor that they thought they can bury through. So a big way to prevent that or watch for that is make sure you're using an accounting system. QuickBooks is the least expensive out there for a small to medium-sized business. And a lot of people, when they use QuickBooks, shortcut to either pull the transactions in right from the bank so the vendor names don't actually get populated, or when they're recording credit card activity, they record the full, you have a $25,000 statement, well, 6,000 is supplies and 7,000 is dues, and they just summarize it. If you take the few extra minutes to type in all the detail and put vendor names, QuickBooks and all decent accounting softwares have search capabilities, and you can run reports based on vendor names, based on who your biggest vendors are by size. Lots of ways to just quickly take a brief glance at your dashboard and see, does something look like it's strange? Does something look like it's up? And again, you don't want that to be, back to the beginning of our conversation, you don't want that to be the same person that does all the banking and all the posting, because that's when you're leaving yourself open for trouble. You need a third set of eyes to just be looking through and making sure things look okay.
Right. And then, of course, you want to make sure that if you do have that person who does the QuickBooks, they're not the only one with access to that information.
Correct.
Right. Because again, that's another account that is password protected. And we've, talked about situations where the doctor can't even get access to their own QuickBook accounts when they're trying to get help. Right.
Yes. And doctors, healthcare professionals, generally aren't trained in business and want someone else to handle it so they can be healing and curing their patients. That's why they became doctors. But if you own the business, you can't completely ignore that side of things. You have to be checking in on it, whether it's quarterly, twice a year. You need to actually have your mind flip back to the business side of things often enough that you're on top of things.
Right.
It's really important.
So one last thing, and I want to kind of talk about, and this certainly, we're not talking really about HIPAA here, but in addition to HIPAA training within your practice, I think we also need to think about the information that's collected by a practice. Often patient social security numbers, their names, their credit card information, and there has been, some gross misuse by employees of medical practices who have collected this information and sold it. And it just happened to be employees because of medical practices, because they do collect information and patients are always willing to turn that over. Often social security can be tied to your insurance card, etc. So it's kind of the natural place. You got the date of birth, you got, information that you wouldn't necessarily collect in other types of businesses. So I would say, a dental practice, a medical practice is a huge source of information for stealing personal information. And I think practices, HIPAA aside, need to think about who has access to that information, how are they storing it, is it seem like somebody's accessing it inappropriately, what kind of safeguards do they have in place? And then if a patient does complain about something, hey, my credit card looks like it was used, and the last time I used it was at your practice, etc. I think, business owners need to immediately jump on that and investigate and not just assume, oh, it has nothing to do with us, because it's well known that there are, rings of employees who work at practices that take this information and misuse it. I don't know if you've come across that at all.
I haven't come across that specific situation, but I've heard enough horror stories. I always recommend that you look at your insurance coverage as a practice and you make sure that your liability package includes an employee fidelity insurance, employee honesty insurance. It's a very low cost premium that is typically packaged in with most policies, but you want to make sure it's there. And that way, if your employee does something dishonest that impacts your patients or impacts your practice financially, that insurance coverage would kick in. You still would prefer it never happened, but at least make sure you're protected. Right. And if you're not having your insurance agent walk with you through all of your insurance needs, at least semi-annually, if not annually, you definitely should do so, because in this world of dishonesty, lots of technology, you want to make sure you have cybersecurity coverage, which is relatively new, business interruption insurance, and again, the fidelity bond, the employee fidelity insurance is important as well.
Right. I think that's great advice. All right, so let's round up and kind of think about what we learned here. We learned that you should not have the same employee wearing multiple hats. You should be doing background checks on employees. You should be very wary if you do have long-term employees that are suddenly going through certain hardships, not taking vacation, not sharing passwords, etc. You should be using your banking system and your accountant to help be that extra set of eyes to make sure that they're able to spot anything that might be going on. You should, if you're owner of a practice and you're very busy practicing, still take that time to understand that you've got to keep an eye about what's going on in your practice. And that includes not only the financial aspects, but also the use of your medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, prescription writing, etc. So there's a lot to think about here, but I agree with you. We've heard a lot of horror stories, and I guess the only way for somebody out there to prevent it from happening to their practice is to really think about what they've been doing till now and what could go wrong and what steps they might take to prevent it before it's too late. And I love the insurance recommendation. I think that's great. And I bet a lot of doctors and dentists haven't really, made sure that they have that in place. Any final words you want to share?
No, I think we don't want to have this be a horror story that scares everyone, but opportunities to help protect yourself better than you already are.
Excellent. Well, I hope that everybody out there will reach out to Laura if they have any questions on what she could do to help your practice protect itself if you're not taking the necessary steps. We're both happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you want to find out some more about the other podcasts we've done on similar topics, you can check at ralaw.com. Again, this is the HealthLaw Hotspot, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
The Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot is made available by the firm and its attorneys for educational purposes and to provide general information, not to provide specific legal advice. Use of the Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the firm or any of its attorneys. The Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice, and you should contact an attorney in your state about any legal needs or questions you may have.